Now that we've covered the three main measures of central tendency, we've talked about the mean, we've talked about the median, we've talked about the mode, it's best to discuss which one we should use and when we should use it, right? So, one, let's describe the differences between the mean, median, and mode. Remember, the mean is like an average. The median is sort of that center value where half of the data set lies below the median and half of it lies above, right? The big difference between the mean and the median is resistance to outliers. Specifically, the median is resistant to outliers, specifically if it is non-symmetrical, right? If there are a bunch of high outliers versus a bunch of outliers on both sides. If there's outliers on both sides, they more or less end up canceling each other out, right? So there's not really any difference there's not much difference between mean and median at that point. But if you have a bunch of high outliers but not any low outliers, that mean is going to be skewed by the outliers, and the median is going to be resistant to them, right? And then the last one that we talked about was the mode, and the mode is the highest count or the highest frequency. And this is typically what we're going to use whenever we're dealing with categorical data. It doesn't make very much sense to talk about a median or a mean with data that is non-ordinal, right? It doesn't have an inherent order to it, right? From smallest to largest or anything along those lines, or it's non-numeric, right? We talked about colors of car being a great example of the categorical data. Whether something is red, silver, blue, white, black, etc. We in our experiment we showed that red was the car that was the most frequent. So, when we're looking at a data set, it's important for us to choose the appropriate one of these to describe that data set, right? And when we're talking about our basic statistics, we're talking about descriptive statistics, right? We're trying to describe our data set with just a limited number of parameters, right? In this case, a measure of center. So we've got an example here that covers the incomes of the following 10 households. We can see that there is one really big outlier here. We can see that it is non-symmetrical. That is, there's only a really high outlier. There's not a really low outlier. And as a matter of fact, it would be impossible for there to be a low outlier. Someone would have to have somehow have a negative household income. And that's not the case here, right? This starts at 0 and the next lowest value is 30,000. So we can see the mean comes out to $89,150 and the median is $53,500. So we ask ourselves, which of these two descriptive statistics, the median or the mean, describes this data set most accurately? And here we're going to go with the median, right? If we actually look at our data set here, right, most of the data is in between $30,000 and $60,000, and that 53,500 seems to be a pretty decent representation of the bulk of the data here. Whereas the mean at 89,150 doesn't really accurately describe our data set, right? There's only one household that has anywhere near that income, and that's the household that has an income that's far greater than that, right? $457,000, right? This $89,150 doesn't really describe any of the data in our data set very accurately. It doesn't sort of describe this lower grouping very accurately, nor does it describe this outlier very accurately. So in this case, it's likely that we're going to choose the median because it is the best representation of our data set when we're trying to describe it. Now, that's when we're trying to describe it. When we are actually not trying to describe it, but we're doing some sort of analysis, we're almost always going to end up using the mean instead of the median, and that's because it's unbiased. We're going to talk about that a lot later when we get into inferential statistics. Now, as we mentioned, right, because that mean is unbiased, right, when there aren't a lot of data sets with outliers, we're going to want to use the mean more often than not. And then the only case in which we're going to choose to use the mode is when we're using this categorical data, right? And that's data that is generally not ordinal in its nature, right? The term center might be taking a little bit of liberty here, but we're describing the most common item in our data set when we use the mode. So when we're describing a data set, it makes sense to talk about the mean or the average. It makes sense to use the median sometimes, and then depending on the type of data, it might be appropriate to use the mode, right? So what's really important is to actually look at your data, make a decision which one of these measures of center best describes your data, and then to use that one in your preliminary analysis when you're looking at maybe just some basic analysis of a data set. So that's the three different types of central tendency that we're talking about here, the differences between them, and a little bit about how to choose which one you're going to use in which situation. Next up, we're going to talk about the 5-number summary, and after that, we're going to talk a little bit about the variance and standard deviation, and that's going to finish up this introductory descriptive statistics unit.